The Sahel regions of West Africa have become hotspots of escalating violence, driven by extremist groups like Boko Haram, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM. On the top of this, in recent years, the Sahel region in Africa has experienced a troubling number of military coups, and these takeovers have dramatically impacted the political and security situation in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, and Niger. Stems in Nigeria, Boko Haram's insurgency has spread to neighboring countries, including Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, wreaking havoc across the region. Pertinently, the groups that remain in news discourse in recent years are ISGS, aligned with ISIS, and AQIM, affiliated with Al-Qaeda, which operates across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, using the vast desert terrain to launch coordinated attacks. AQIM has destabilized much of the Sahel through alliances with other militant groups. Despite ongoing international efforts, these groups continue to fuel insecurity, displacing millions and leaving the region in turmoil. Let's dive into the roots of this conflict and explore how it's reshaped the political landscape of the Sahel region, affecting the lives of millions. Stay tuned to our channel for more insights, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. In 2011, after months of civil war and NATO intervention, Muammar Gaddafi, the longtime leader of Libya, was overthrown and killed. Gaddafi had ruled Libya for over 40 years, maintaining a regime that was both heavily centralized and reliant on military power. The power vacuum left behind in Libya following Gaddafi's demise led to a rapid disintegration of the state's authority. Multiple rival factions and militias, many with competing political and tribal interests, fought for control over Libya's resources, territory, and institutions. It impacts the West African Sahel region drastically. After Gaddafi's fall, vast quantities of weapons, including heavy artillery, small arms, and even surface-to-air missiles, flooded to the Sahel region. These weapons were looted from Libyan arsenals and spread throughout the Sahel and beyond, contributing to the militarization of numerous armed groups across the region. This scenario triggers conflict and instability in neighboring countries, particularly in the Western Sahel region. The Sahel region, stretching from Senegal to Eritrea, is a vast area between the Sahara Desert and the African tropics. Pertinently, for decades, this region has faced serious security and humanitarian challenges. Since gaining independence in the 1960s, many countries in the Sahel have struggled with violent extremism. This has been fueled by a combination of weak governments, economic hardships, and the worsening impacts of climate change. The fall of Gaddafi in Libya gave impetus to extremist groups, and eventually the situation in Mali, one of the countries situated in the Sahel region, deteriorated rapidly. The instability in Libya allowed groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, the Movement for Oneness, and Jihad in West Africa, MUJAO, and later the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGA, to gain a foothold in the countries Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Many of these groups took advantage of the porous borders, weak state structures, and widespread insecurity to expand their influence. Pertinently, in 2012, a Tuareg rebellion, initially supported by former Gaddafi loyalists and heavily armed with weapons from Libya, seized the northern region of Mali and declared their own state in northern Mali, called Azawad. This was followed by a military coup in Mali, leading to further instability. By mid-2012, the northern part of Mali was controlled by a combination of separatist groups and Islamist militants, including AQI and MUJAO. In response, France launched Operation Serval in January 2013 to push back militant groups and reclaim Mali's northern territories. The United Nations also deployed a peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, to support the recovery of the state. Despite these efforts, the region remains unstable, with ongoing insurgencies and periodic violence. The conflict didn't stay in Mali. In 2014, there was a popular uprising in Burkina Faso, a neighboring country of Mali, that led to a big change in the country's leadership. After that, the conflict in northern Mali started to spill over into Burkina Faso, with attacks even reaching the capital, Ouagadougou, on January 15, 2016. By 2018, things got worse, especially in the northern and eastern parts of the country, where more and more armed groups took control of different areas. Between 2019 and 2021, security incidents tripled. Then, in 2022, there were 2 coups, one in January and another in September. In just 1 year, 3 different presidents served. Since 2019, over 10,000 civilians have been killed in these attacks, with 2,550 of them dying since the start of 2024. And since the beginning of 2023, there have been around 100 clashes every month between government forces and these armed groups. Another neighboring country, Niger, has been dealing with increasing militant activity since 2018, with violence hitting its peak in 2021 based on the number of deaths. Even though there were more political violence incidents in 2022, the number of people killed dropped significantly. By the first half of 2023, things had improved further, with a 39% decrease in political violence compared to the last half of 2022. Attacks on civilians went down by 49%, and related deaths dropped by 16%. On July 26, 2023, Niger experienced a military coup when the Presidential Guard detained President Mohamed Bazoum and his family. The coup leaders, calling themselves the National Council for the Safeguarding of the Homeland, CNSP, announced the takeover on TV. Reactions were mixed. Early protests supporting Bazoum were shut down by soldiers, while later rallies showed support for the CNSP. By July 27, the Nigerian armed forces backed the CNSP to avoid violence and protect the president and his family. All of these countries share porous borders, weak governments, and remote areas that are hard to control, which makes it easy for militants to move around and set up bases. Today, the Sahel is still in turmoil. While some militant groups have been pushed back, the overall situation remains unstable. Militant attacks, armed groups, and ethnic tensions continue to cause chaos. Governments in the region are struggling to regain control, and poverty and corruption remain widespread. Some countries, like Mali, have even turned to Russia for help, complicating international relations further. What started as a local conflict soon spiraled into a much bigger crisis, spreading across the entire Sahel. Today, countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are at the heart of this ongoing conflict. These nations, all currently run by military juntas, are battling a decade-long insurgency led by Al-Qaeda's Sahel branch, known as Jama'at Nuslam wal Muslimin, JNI, and the Islamic State Sahel province. One particularly unstable area is the Liptako-Gourma region, where Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger meet. The situation has become even more complicated due to splits among the various groups, leading to more violence and conflict. In the past 10 years, violence and crime have increased significantly, creating problems not just for the region, but for global stability too. The Sahel has also become a key route for migrants from sub-Saharan Africa trying to reach northern Africa and Europe. As violence continues to rise, more people are being forced to flee, putting pressure on countries in northern Africa and Europe to manage the influx. The ongoing chaos in the Sahel region poses a significant threat to both international and U.S. interests, particularly due to the displacement of over 3.4 million people. Among them, more than 110,000 have fled to West African coastal states, raising alarms about the potential destabilization of these democracies and challenges for the Economic Community of West African States, ESOS, which has long worked to maintain regional stability. This threat is set to escalate in January 2025, when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three military-led governments forming the new Alliance of Sahel states, officially withdraw from the Economic Community of West Africa, ECOWAS, a regional and political and economic union of 15 countries. This move will have major repercussions, especially for these landlocked nations. It will increase the costs of imports, restrict cross-border movement, and likely strain diplomatic and security relations with neighboring countries. To avoid a deeper crisis, West African governments need to act swiftly. Urgent negotiations are essential to manage the withdrawal terms and to develop strategies that can minimize economic disruptions and security risks across the region. Without proactive measures, this shift could lead to more instability and strained relations across West Africa. Over the past 15 years, chaos in the Sahel has only grown as people lost trust in their governments. Whether under authoritarian regimes or corrupt democracies, leaders seemed more focused on serving elites than addressing the needs of ordinary citizens. As a result, people struggled to find security, stable livelihoods, and hope for a better future. This discontent fueled the rise of extremism, insurgencies, and civil conflicts, which have intensified since 2020 with a wave of 8 military coups. On top of that, worsening climate shocks, heavy-handed military responses from governments and their allies, and, more recently, Russia's involvement, have only made things worse. The region is now caught in a cycle of instability that shows no signs of slowing down. The crisis in Mali that kicked off in early 2012, and by early 2013, the militants were advancing south. They captured a town called Konna, which prompted France to step in with a military operation called Operation Serval. French and Malian forces managed to push the extremists out of the major cities, but the militants just shifted to rural areas, where they kept operating. One result of the French intervention was that many key AQIM leaders were killed, weakening the group. Ansar Dine then took charge, acting as a front for Al-Qaeda to spread their influence. Eventually, all these smaller groups merged into one larger group in 2017, known as Jamaat Nusratul Islam wal Aslamin, or JNIM, with Ansar Dine's leader, Agali, as its head. This new group, JNIM, brought together different factions under a single leadership. Their strategy focused on winning local support, especially in rural areas, by tapping into grievances like land disputes, corruption, and unfair treatment by the government. They also targeted local leaders who opposed them and replaced them with allies. As JNIM expanded, violence spread across Mali and into neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger. Their attacks became more frequent and widespread, making them a dominant force in the region. JNIM's rise marked a shift in how these groups operated, focusing not just on fighting, but also on building a network that connected different communities across the Sahel. After France's Operation Serval in 2013 pushed back the militants, things calmed down a bit. But by late 2016, a second wave of violence broke out, spreading into Burkina Faso and Niger. Two key groups emerged, Ansarul Islam and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS. Ansarul Islam started out along the Mali-Burkina Faso border, with its founder, Ibrahim Malam Dicko, drawing support from local communities, especially the Fulani and Rimayabe. The group tapped into frustrations about inequality, and this message resonated, attracting followers. At the same time, ISGS formed from fighters who were loyal to Al-Morabitoun, a splinter group of Al-Qaeda. These militants, active in the Mali-Niger border areas, shifted allegiance to the Islamic State and began working on a broader agenda. In 2016, both groups launched attacks in Burkina Faso and Niger. ISGS carried out assaults on army bases and attempted a major prison break in Niger. Although they started with small numbers, about 50 fighters, they quickly expanded by forging ties with Ansarul Islam and other smaller groups. The relationship between ISGS and the Islamic State in Iraq was limited at first. They pledged allegiance but didn't get much direct support. Over time, these groups began cooperating more closely, especially in regions where their influence overlapped. Here's the key difference between ISGS and JNIM, Jamaat al-Nusra wal-Muslimin, the Al-Qaeda-affiliated coalition. ISGS focuses on global jihad and aims to establish a worldwide caliphate. Their tactics are brutal with high civilian casualties. In contrast, JNIM is more focused on fighting local governments and foreign forces, using a strategy that builds local alliances and exploits grievances. JNIM works hard to maintain a populist image, often avoiding civilian targets to keep local support. When these two groups collaborate, it's often against civilians, but JNIM tries to avoid taking credit for the violence to protect its image. ISGS, on the other hand, thrives on fear and uses extreme violence to assert control and recruit fighters. In terms of scale, JNIM is more active and has a broader network of alliances, but ISGS has been growing rapidly, especially after being officially recognized again by the Islamic State in 2019. Their focus now includes targeting governments, local defense groups, and Christian communities. The third phase of militant activity in the Sahel kicked off around late 2017. This phase saw Islamist groups spreading further across the region, especially into the east region of Burkina Faso and parts of Niger. It was marked by a sharp rise in violence, with militants targeting international forces in Mali and opening up new fronts to stretch French counter-militant efforts and undermine the G5 Sahel forces' effectiveness. During this time, groups like JNIM worked to form alliances and bring together different factions. Their strategy involved spreading southward, which created more challenges for governments already struggling to handle existing threats. The violence escalated because both militants and governments started arming local groups, which only fueled the conflict. Interestingly, 2018 and 2019 were years of both success and struggle for JNIM. On one hand, France's Operation Barkhane claimed significant victories, killing or capturing many militant leaders. However, JNIM expanded its reach dramatically, becoming active in 120 new locations by 2019. This expansion hit Burkina Faso particularly hard, with new conflict zones emerging in the east, southwest, and center-north regions. While 2018 was all about expansion, 2019 saw these groups consolidating their control. The center-north region became a hotspot for violence and a humanitarian disaster. JNIM and ISGS started the year with a series of suicide bombings, including a major attack on a European Union training mission near Bamako and a deadly assault on a UN peacekeeping base in Kidal. A troubling aspect of this phase was the rise in communal violence. Local militias, often armed by governments, targeted Fulani communities, accusing them of supporting militants. In retaliation, JNIM and ISGS launched joint attacks, forcing national armies to retreat from border areas between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Some of these attacks were among the deadliest ever recorded. The situation worsened because of abuses by state forces, including extrajudicial killings. This heavy-handed approach deepened the crisis as government-backed militias turned on rival ethnic communities. By 2019, almost half of all violent incidents in the region involved attacks on civilians, highlighting the growing brutality of the conflict. The crisis in the Sahel has grown worse and spread far beyond its original boundaries since 2012. Since 2017, things have changed dramatically, showing how both militant groups and local militias adapt to new environments. These groups, especially AQ and IS affiliates, have thrived by tapping into local disputes, turning identities into weapons, pushing global jihad narratives, and forming complex alliances. While many see the violence in the Sahel as part of a global jihadist movement, the truth is that most of the instability stems from local, often ethnic tensions. One major point is that militant groups don't just appear out of nowhere. They rise from existing local conflicts and take advantage of political chaos. These groups have moved from quick-hit attacks to full-scale rural insurgencies, and sometimes even urban assaults. Their success largely comes from the disorganization and weak governance in the region. Jihadist branding and coordination give them an edge in taking advantage of these conditions. COVID-19 became a strategic opportunity for them, rather than slowing things down. While many hoped the pandemic might reduce violence or bring about a ceasefire, the levels of conflict remained steady. JNIM and ISGS, for example, kept fighting as before, with some JNIM members defecting to ISGS due to internal disputes. The pandemic has only sped up existing trends, with ISGS using it as a propaganda tool to criticize JNIM. Looking ahead, other countries like Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Togo, and Benin face similar risks. Côte d'Ivoire, for example, has political tensions that could lead to violence, especially with upcoming elections, and the possibility of instability spilling over from Mali and Burkina Faso. Poor governance, inequality, and political corruption are key factors that could ignite conflict. A key takeaway is that conflict doesn't need to start with jihadist ideologies. It often begins with local grievances and opportunism. Once violence takes hold, groups like JNIM and ISGS adapt and escalate the situation. Their tactics and goals may overlap in some ways, but they have different strategies which shape how they carry out attacks. ISGS, in particular, has become more aggressive, targeting civilians for maximum impact, signaling its ambition to dominate. On the top of this, in recent years, the Sahel region in Africa has experienced a troubling number of military coups, and these takeovers have dramatically impacted the political and security situation in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, and Niger. After the 2011 Mali coup, in 2014 Burkina Faso experienced its own military coup, which was the result of massive protests against President Blaise Compaoré. Compaoré had been in power for 27 years, and when he attempted to change the constitution to extend his rule, the people had enough. The military stepped in, forced Compaoré to flee, and took control. However, after several months of political negotiations, Burkina Faso eventually set up a transitional government, aiming to return to civilian rule. But even after this, political instability continued, and in 2015, there was a failed coup attempt by a military faction, further deepening the country's instability. Fast forward to 2020, and Mali was once again in the midst of political unrest. By this time, the country had been grappling with ongoing jihadist violence in the north, corruption, and poor governance. Protests against President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta had been growing for months, demanding his resignation. In August 2020, the military took matters into their own hands and overthrew Keïta, forcing him to resign. The coup leaders promised a transition to civilian rule, but instead, they installed a military-led government, with Colonel Assimi Goïta eventually becoming the interim president. The military's grip on power has continued, and Mali's return to full democracy remains uncertain. In 2021, Chad saw a coup that was a bit different from the others. President Idriss Déby, who had been in power for 30 years, was killed while fighting rebels in the north of the country. His death created an immediate crisis, and the military quickly took control, declaring that Déby's son, Mahamat Idriss Déby, would lead a transitional government. This military takeover sparked protests and calls for civilian rule, as many in Chad didn't want another military-led government. However, the military promised to hold elections within 18 months, though it remains unclear whether they will truly transition to democracy. Just a few months later, in September 2021, Guinea experienced its own military coup. President Alpha Condé, who had been in power since 2010, won a controversial third term in office after changing the constitution in 2020. This decision sparked protests across the country, with many people feeling that Condé was becoming increasingly authoritarian. On September 5, 2021, the military, led by Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, seized control, detaining Condé and dissolving the government. The military claimed they were stepping in to restore order and end corruption. While the military promised a return to civilian rule, there's been significant concern about the future of democracy in Guinea. In 2023, Niger became the latest Sahel country to experience a military coup. President Mohamed Bazoum, who had been elected in 2021, was overthrown by the military on July 26, 2023. The coup came after months of growing dissatisfaction with Bazoum's handling of security issues in the face of rising jihadist violence. The military cited failure in addressing the security situation as the main reason for taking power. This coup triggered a tense standoff with international bodies like ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which called for Bazoum's release and the restoration of civilian rule. Niger's situation remains tense, and it's uncertain what the future holds. The repeated military coups in the Sahel have created major instability. They often lead to increased violence, displacement of civilians, and humanitarian crises. For example, in Mali, the rise of extremist groups following the 2012 coup has led to thousands of deaths and hundreds of thousands of people displaced. Furthermore, these coups disrupt efforts to address security issues as the international community struggles to engage with military governments. The lack of civilian rule means that long-term development and peace-building efforts are hindered, and the region remains trapped in a cycle of instability. Sahel reflects deep-rooted issues in governance, security, and economic challenges. These coups have not only changed the political landscapes of these countries, but also contributed to the region's ongoing crises. While some military leaders promise to restore stability, the future of democracy in the Sahel looks uncertain, and the region remains one of the most fragile in the world.